On January 17, 1960, in the sweltering jungles of Bentry, South Vietnam, an event unfolded that would forever reshape the future of modern warfare and puncture the credibility of the world's most powerful military. 5,000 women emerged from Mekong Delta villages like ghosts, summoned from an ancient nightmare, besieging fortified military outposts armed only with crudely fashioned bamboo stakes that looked like rifles. Inside the bunkers, soldiers trained by American advisors and armed with millions of dollars worth of weapons were in a state of utter panic. They abandoned their positions, their weapons, even their grasp of reality. What they encountered that night was no ghost. It was something far more disturbing, an act of psychological warfare, so carefully calculated, so precise, so ingrained in primal fears and cultural manipulation, that even more than 60 years later, the Pentagon's records of the operation remain sealed because they are too dangerous to release to the public. The architect of this improbable victory was known to US intelligence as the most dangerous individual in Southeast Asia, a woman so terrifying that seasoned veterans refused to speak her name. Yet her story appears only sporadically buried in dusty archives and deliberately omitted from Western history books by officials who understood that some weapons were too horrific to admit. Before we continue the chilling tale of Quanton and the psychological campaign she perpetrated on thousands of American soldiers, take a moment to subscribe to Sleepy History Tales if you crave the darkest chapters in military history that governments have tried to erase. Ring the notification bell and let us know in the comments where in the US or beyond you're listening. We'd love to know what our growing community of dark history explorers are listening in on. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you've been told about the Vietnam War and reveal why some veterans still wake up screaming from nightmares that may never have been dreams. In 1960, the Mekong Delta was a maze of rivers, rice paddies, and dense jungle seemingly designed by nature to swallow armies whole. Bentry Province, locally called the Land of Coconut, spread across this hostile terrain like a deep green wound. Its 800,000 inhabitants were trapped between rival forces that threatened to rip their lives apart. The air hung heavy and wet, thick enough to choke, carrying the sweet rot of decaying vegetation mixed with something sharper, the metallic taste of fear that had lingered since the French colonial era. Here visibility rarely stretched beyond 30 feet. The jungle breathed like a living thing, malicious and unending, erasing the line between civilization and primordial wilderness. Into this shadowed world was born Guantani Din on March 15, 1920, the youngest daughter of a poor farming family in Luang Hoa Commune, Gyeongtrom District. Her childhood unfolded under the cold efficiency of French colonial rule, where public executions served as macabre afternoon spectacles and entire villages could vanish overnight for harboring the wrong loyalties. The French had perfected a method of terror that went beyond mere brutality. They knew fear worked best when it became the very atmosphere, inescapable, oppressive, as constant as the humidity. Young Den witnessed scenes that would scar most people for life. At just 7 years old, she watched French soldiers force her entire village to witness the slow, deliberate dismemberment of a suspected revolutionary. His screams rolled across the rice paddies for hours. But what haunted her was not the gore itself. It was the meticulous precision with which the French commander staged the ordeal, timing each slice not to increase the victim's suffering, but to deepen the psychological torment of the crowd. She noticed how he observed the villagers more than the dying man watching, who looked away, who retched, who stood frozen in silence. Frozen in horror, young Den absorbed her first true lesson in psychological warfare. By 16, she had witnessed enough orchestrated cruelty to know that human beings, under the right conditions, were capable of acts that defied imagination. But unlike those who broke beneath the weight of such trauma, Den studied it with the detached focus of a scientist observing an experiment. She began to trace patterns in human fear, the way terror spread through a village, like an infection, how a single sound or image could bypass reason and ignite a primal response. Her path from farm girl to revolutionary began not with ideology, but with a private tragedy that would shape her into something unprecedented in the annals of military history. In October 1938, Den married Nguyen Van Bish, a charismatic member of the Indochinese Communist Party whose devotion to independence matched his charm. Their happiness lasted barely a year. In October 1939, 9 months pregnant with their first child, Den awoke to the sound of boots outside their door. French colonial police surrounded the house in a pre-dawn raid. Hidden in a narrow compartment, she watched as they beat her husband unconscious, his blood pooling across the floorboards of the home they had built together. 3 days after giving birth to their son Guan Huan, she was granted a single 15-minute visit with her battered husband. Barely recognizable beneath swelling and bruises, he whispered words that would guide her for the rest of her life. They think they understand fear because they inflict it. But fear, properly cultivated, can be turned back on its creator like a mirror. Remember this. 6 months later, word reached her that Nguyen had died inside Kondao prison. Authorities refused to return his body or explain the cause of death. But villagers whispered of the underground tiger cages where political prisoners were kept in concrete pits barely large enough to crouch. Iron grates above allowed guards to urinate and defecate on those below. Prisoners were fed rice mixed with sand until their teeth wore to stumps salt water that left them delirious with thirst. Fish sauce crawling with maggots. Some were driven to cannibalism. Others retreated so completely into their own minds that even the most sadistic tortures could no longer reach them. These stories would later inspire some of Den's most chilling psychological techniques. Her own turn came in June 1940, when French authorities arrested her, while her son was just 8 months old. They timed the capture for maximum psychological damage, waiting until she was breastfeeding before tearing the infant from her arms. His screams echoed after her as soldiers dragged her away, a sound she later said never left her waking thoughts. For 3 years inside Baria, prison Den learned the mechanics of terror firsthand. She discovered how prolonged sensory deprivation fractures the mind in predictable stages. How isolation can be weaponized to make a prisoner question their own memories. And most crucially, how fear spreads through a population with mathematical precision, following patterns as predictable as the outbreak of disease. Baria was where the transformation began in earnest. Den observed how different personalities collapsed under different pressures. Some endured savage beatings yet crumbled when forced to hear recordings of their children crying. Others survived whippings but lost their sanity when plunged into absolute silence. She began keeping careful mental notes, cataloging human vulnerabilities with the precision of a scholar. These observations became the foundation of her future doctrine of psychological warfare. When she was finally released in 1943, emaciated, suffering from severe malnutrition, and what French doctors dismissively labeled female hysteria, but which was almost certainly extreme post-traumatic stress, Den stepped into a Vietnam already transformed. The Japanese occupation had ignited new revolutionary fervor and the Viet Minh resistance was gathering momentum. Hardened by loss imprisonment and a relentless education in the anatomy of fear, Den threw herself into organizing women in Bentry province. But she carried with her something no ordinary revolutionary, possessed a terrifying new understanding of how the human mind could be turned into a weapon. Unlike most resistance fighters, Den brought to the movement something far more dangerous than conventional guerrilla skill, a profound understanding of psychological manipulation. She had studied the French and seen how they wielded terror, not merely to kill, but to paralyze entire populations with dread. She knew that rumors could be more lethal than bullets, that the anticipation of violence could shatter morale more effectively than violence itself. Most crucially, she had learned that the human mind pushed to its limits could be programmed like a machine. Given the right sensory triggers, people would react in predictable ways no matter their training or conscious will. By 1945, as World War II collapsed and Vietnam ignited in revolution, Den remarried a fellow revolutionary, Ton Van Hutri. He admired her dedication but was often unsettled by the icy precision with which she planned her operations. She spoke not of territory or casualty counts, but of breaking the enemy's mind, of making soldiers see threats everywhere, trust no one, and ultimately turn their weapons against shadows. During this period, she began shaping what she called the doctrine of imposed madness, the belief that an enemy could be driven insane without direct confrontation, simply by controlling their perceptual environment with enough care and patience. In 1946, her reputation reached Hanoi. Den was chosen for a 4-person delegation sent north to petition Ho Chi Minh himself for weapons and support for the southern resistance. Upon meeting her, Ho reportedly remarked, "This woman understands what our generals do not, that in modern war the mind is both the ultimate weapon and the ultimate target." He not only approved her request for arms, but granted her something far more powerful: freedom to develop her psychological warfare theories without interference from traditional military command. 14 years later, the morning of January the 17th, 1960, arrived with an eerie stillness that veteran soldiers would later recognize as the quiet before psychological hell. Across fortified hamlets in Bentry province, South Vietnamese troops maintained their posts confident in their American-supplied weapons and training. None of them realized they were about to become unwilling participants in one of the most disturbing military experiments in recorded history. For months, Den had been preparing what she codenamed Operation Mind Spider, a title deliberately chosen to be accidentally discovered and ignite paranoid speculation about invisible webs and inescapable traps. Her planning went far beyond ordinary military logistics. Through an intelligence network that included prostitutes, barbers, laundry women, and even children who sold fruit to the garrisons, she compiled psychological dossiers on every single soldier in every outpost. These profiles were terrifyingly complete. They knew which men suffered recurring nightmares of drowning and placed them near riverbanks. They knew who had watched a father die and arranged for those soldiers to hear phantom paternal voices in the darkness. They identified those haunted by family histories of mental illness, and set them up for experiences designed to make them question their own sanity. Every man's deepest fear had been catalogued, analyzed, and weaponized. The first phase began at exactly 3:00 a.m., the hour when human resistance is weakest. Guards on the night shift began reporting sounds, unnatural noises that didn't belong to the jungle. At first it was children's laughter, but played backward at a low pitch, a tone known to trigger primitive fear responses deep in the amygdala. Then came the smell, a sickly blend of rotting lotus blossoms and incense used in funeral rites, drifting on smoke that seemed to move against the wind. Private Tranvam stationed at the Pork Heap outpost was the first to see them. In an official report filed days later, his handwriting trembling across the page, he described the moment with chilling clarity. Figures emerged from the mist, but their movements were wrong. Some crawled backward on all fours, others walked balanced on their hands. A few twisted and contorted in ways no human joints should allow. Their faces were painted ghost white, like funeral masks, but their eyes, those eyes were pools of pure black, as if someone had poured ink straight into their skulls. They were unmistakably women, yet they did not move like women. They did not move like humans. They moved like things pretending to be human and not quite getting it right. What stepped out of the pre-dawn mist shattered every expectation the soldiers held about warfare. Hundreds of women appeared at once from every direction, their movements synchronized with a precision that seemed impossible without radios or signals. Each carried what looked like a rifle, but something about the shapes was wrong. In the fog, the proportions of the weapons seemed to violate physics. Some rifles bent at angles no metal should allow. Others appeared to ripple and shift as the mist curled round them. The attack began not with bullets, but with sound. The women spoke in perfect unison, but not in sentences, only in fragments, overlapping voices that fused into a single inhuman wall of noise. The words were in the local dialect, but distorted with tonal variations that made familiar phrases sound alien and threatening. Then the voices became personal. They recited private details no enemy should have known, soldiers' childhood nicknames, their mothers' names, descriptions of birthmarks hidden beneath their uniforms. Secrets they had never spoken aloud. Lieutenant Nuan Kalpat, commanding the outpost, barked orders to ready weapons. But as his men moved to obey, the women began to mimic them exactly, only in reverse. When a soldier raised his rifle, his mirror lowered hers. When a man stepped forward, his counterpart stepped back. The effect was profoundly disorienting, as though reality itself had developed a glitch. Then came the photographs. Hundreds of them hurled through the air like a paper storm. These were no random images. Each photo was tailored to a specific soldier. Some showed the men's own funerals, perfectly staged and eerily convincing. Others depicted their families at home, but subtly wrong. A child with too many fingers. A wife whose smile stretched unnaturally wide. A mother whose eyes were bottomless black. The photographs were postmarked with future dates, implying events that had not yet occurred. Survivors would later call what followed the revelation phase. The women began shouting out soldiers' names and recounting their most private thoughts, dreams they had the night before, secret letters they had written but never sent. One woman stood directly in front of the fortification and recited word for word a childhood prayer that Private Nuan Vanduke had whispered silently to himself every night since he was 5. He had never shared it with another living soul at exactly 4:17 a.m., a time chosen, because Vietnamese numerology links those numbers to death and transformation. The next stage began. Firecrackers erupted, but these were no ordinary celebratory bursts. Each charge had been chemically modified to mimic the acoustic signatures of real weapons: American M16s, Soviet AK-47s, Chinese grenades. The overlapping sounds created a sonic chaos so convincing that soldiers could not tell whether they were under live fire or listening to illusions. The smoke was laced with mild hallucinogens extracted from local plants, not enough to induce full visions, but sufficient to make the edges of reality flicker. Shadows seemed to breathe. Jungle trees appeared to sway against the wind. Private Min would later describe the exact instant his mind broke. The woman in front of me? She took off her face. Not a mask, her skin. She peeled it back, and underneath was my own face, staring at me. Her mouth moved in perfect sync with thoughts I hadn't even spoken. That's when I ran. We all ran. You can't fight something that crawls inside your head like that. Panic consumed the outpost. Soldiers ripped off their uniforms as they fled, as though the fabric itself carried contamination. Some were found days later wandering naked through the jungle, unable to describe what they had witnessed. Others disappeared entirely, deserting, rather than risk a second encounter with the nightmare. In less than 6 hours, without firing a single real bullet, Dense Force seized 159 weapons, machine guns, mortars, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. But the captured arsenal was secondary to the true victory, the psychological contagion. The fleeing soldiers carried their terror with them like an infection. Their stories grew darker, with every retelling women with backward faces, rifles twisting into serpents' photographs that changed when no one was looking. Within days, entire units across Bentry province were haunted by nightmares of creatures that may never have existed, except inside their own minds. The fear became self-sustaining, feeding on its own echoes until Den's forces no longer had to lift a finger. In the days after the Phuoc Cáp incident, South Vietnamese command and the American advisors who backed them found themselves confronting a crisis for which no training manual existed. Official reports from the shattered outposts were so bizarre, so violently at odds with any known form of combat, that many were locked away and classified almost as soon as they were written. Soldiers who insisted on telling their stories were sent for psychiatric evaluations, quietly diagnosed with acute stress reactions, and removed from active duty as if madness itself might be contagious. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrisburg, a career officer hardened by World War II, and Korea arrived in Bentry province on January 25, 1960, to investigate what headquarters delicately called an irregular enemy action employing unconventional tactics. What he found would dismantle every assumption he held about warfare. His private journal, declassified only in 1995 after his death records. The dawning realization that something unprecedented was unfolding. January 28, 1960, interviewed 12 survivors from the Phuoc Heap outpost. Their accounts are consistent only in their contradictions. Each man describes a different nightmare, yet all share the same overwhelming sensation: reality itself coming apart. Private Tran swears he saw his dead grandfather among the attackers. Corporal Nuan insists the women spoke in backward language, yet he understood every word. Sergeant Lee maintains the rifles they carried were built from human bones, despite evidence proving they were carved bamboo. These men are not lying. They believe what they report. Something shattered their perception of the real in a way our psychiatrists cannot explain. February 2, 1960, attempted to reconstruct the engagement using standard military analysis. Impossible. The precision of the simultaneous strikes suggests radio coordination, but no communication equipment was ever found. Stranger still, the enemy possessed intimate psychological profiles of our soldiers' knowledge that existed in no file, sometimes not even in the conscious minds of the men themselves. How does one gather intelligence on a man's private fears? February 8, 1960. Met a retired French colonel who served here in the 40s. When I described the tactics, the color drained from his face. He whispered of a smaller campaign he had once witnessed, something the French had called guerre psychologique, total psychological warfare. He warned me about a woman named Nguyen Thanh. Years ago, she had studied French interrogation methods and refined them into something new. He used a single chilling word: evolved. He said she understood a truth Western military science was only beginning to glimpse, that consciousness itself could be turned into a weapon. The shock of January 17th rippled through the Mekong Delta like cracks spreading across glass. Within days, outposts across the region reported incidents that defied every rule of battle. Women materialized at dawn or dusk, always in the half-light, where shadows deceive, moving with a synchronization that suggested a hive mind rather than separate bodies. Yet no two encounters were identical. Each was tailored to the hidden fears of its targets. At the Bartrai district outpost, the women never spoke. They stood in flawless silence for 7 hours, eyes unblinking, their breathing perfectly synchronized, until the combined rhythm formed an audible pulse like a gigantic heartbeat. When soldiers tried to advance, the women stepped back in exact unison, maintaining an unchanging distance. A nervous soldier fired a warning shot. They did not flinch. They did not even acknowledge the bullet as though it had never existed. The mounting psychological pressure became unbearable. The garrison abandoned its post without a single shot fired at them. In Gyeongtram, the attack took a different shape, what survivors would later call the Night of Wrong Songs. Women encircled the compound and began to sing lullabies in soft, soothing voices. Yet, the lyrics were subtly altered, describing violent deaths and mutilations in the same tender tones mothers used to quiet children. The melody promised comfort, while the words whispered terror, a dissonance that fractured the minds of hardened soldiers more effectively than any weapon of steel or fire. They sang in flawless harmony, each verse unfolding like a soft confession. Yet with every stanza, the sweetness darkened. The women's gentle voices described as calmly as a weather forecast how the soldiers would die. Never as threats, but as if recounting a future already recorded in some inevitable chronicle. Meanwhile, Den shifted restlessly across Bentry province, relocating from one hidden command post to another, while somehow maintaining perfect control over an operation that spanned hundreds of square miles. American intelligence would later uncover the secret, a communication network disguised as ordinary Vietnamese folk music. Minute variations of pitch and rhythm carried complex military instructions. To untrained ears, it was nothing more than women singing as they worked in the fields. To her operatives, it was an encrypted command system no radio intercept could detect or decode. By March 1960, Den had expanded her long-haired army to nearly 5,000 women, each organized into cells that operated with unnerving independence. Training went far beyond guerrilla tactics. Den called it consciousness warfare, the deliberate exploitation of the fragile space between perception and reality. Her recruits learned to craft experiences that would remain in a soldier's mind like invisible shrapnel, inflicting damage long after the encounter was over. The training itself was a crucible of psychological conditioning. Women spent weeks in absolute darkness, honing their senses until they could navigate by sound and scent alone. They practiced unnatural movements that broke the expected mechanics of the human body, creating fleeting visual shocks that triggered primal unease. They trained their voices in overlapping patterns to create acoustic illusions, using techniques from traditional Vietnamese theater to project sound from impossible directions. Most disturbing of all was a discipline Den termed memory implantation. Through meticulous questioning of prisoners and informants, her operators gathered fragments of each target's personal history. These scraps were then woven into encounters that felt like long-buried memories. A soldier might suddenly recall seeing one of Den's women at his mother's funeral, or remember a dream in which she foretold his death. Even under hypnosis, these implanted memories were indistinguishable from reality. At first, the American response was denial. Official reports dismissed the psychological dimension, blaming the soldiers' breakdowns on jungle fever or routine combat stress. Privately, however, military intelligence was in crisis. A classified CIA assessment from April 1960 admitted bluntly, "We are facing an enemy who has weaponized the human mind itself." Traditional doctrine assumed that well-trained soldiers could function despite fear. But what happens when the enemy corrupts perception itself, when a soldier's own senses become hostile territory? By mid-1961, as US involvement in Vietnam deepened, Washington could no longer ignore the reports of entire South Vietnamese units, rendered combat ineffective without a single physical casualty. Alarmed, the Kennedy administration authorized a series of covert research programs to study and counter what analysts now called cognitive warfare. The most ambitious effort, Project Mindbridge, launched in May 1962 under the CIA's Technical Services Division. It brought together an unlikely team: military psychiatrists, anthropologists, stage magicians, and Hollywood special effects designers. Their mission was to reverse engineer Den's methods and develop countermeasures. Files partially declassified in 2010, still scarred with heavy black redactions, reveal the depth of American bewilderment. Dr. Martin Elmsworth, the project's lead psychiatrist, wrote in his first report, "The subject Den has constructed a system of psychological manipulation beyond anything in our current doctrine. She has weaponized culture itself, turning the enemy's own mental frameworks against them. Her operators do not simply attack soldiers, they attack the very conceptual structures that allow soldiers to function." The team's investigation uncovered patterns in Den's strategy that were as precise as they were unsettling. She was not merely fighting a war, she was charting the hidden terrain of the human mind. Using captured records and field interviews, the researchers learned that Den had been systematically mapping what they came to call cultural pressure points, deep-seated fears unique to each population. For South Vietnamese soldiers, she weaponized ancient beliefs in ghosts and ancestor spirits. For American troops, her operators probed a different set of vulnerabilities: the terror of losing one's sanity, the half-buried racial anxieties inherited from World War II propaganda, and the gnawing awareness that the war's official purpose no longer matched its brutal reality. One of her most insidious tactics was something Den herself called reality erosion. Her agents would introduce small, seemingly impossible inconsistencies into a soldier's daily life. A rifle might be found spotless and freshly oiled after a night's sleep, but with the serial number subtly changed. Maps were quietly altered, rivers shifted by a few bends, village names replaced with near homophones. Personal items would vanish only to return as flawless replicas with minute, unnerving differences. The intent was not to shock, but to corrode. Reality itself began to feel unreliable, as if the world were a stage set being imperceptibly rearranged. Captain Dennis Hulbrook, stationed at Kochi in 1965, recorded his unit's ordeal in letters to his wife, letters later confiscated by military censors. It started small, he wrote. Thompson found a photo of his girlfriend in his pocket, but her eyes were a different color. Johnson's lucky coin had the wrong date. We thought someone was playing jokes, but then it got worse. We'd have conversations no one else remembered. Orders would change, but the written copies matched the new version as if they'd always been that way. Men started keeping journals to check their own memories, but even the journals showed entries we didn't write. The pressure mounted until entire platoons experienced what military psychiatrists termed collective dissociative episodes, shared hallucinations, missing hours, or perfectly consistent false memories that no medical test could explain. There were no drugs, no signs of poisoning. It was as though the soldiers' minds simply stopped recording reality, retreating under the relentless assault. In late 1963, Den escalated with what American analysts later called the Children's Campaign. She recruited boys and girls between 7 and 12 years old, training them not as fighters, but as what she chillingly labeled innocence weapons. These children appeared outside American bases, playing seemingly ordinary games, yet every movement was calculated to strike at the deepest layers of the soldiers' psyches. One game in particular became infamous. Children would draw cheerful pictures in the dirt houses, animals, trees. Then, as soldiers watched, they would slowly corrupt the drawings. A house sprouted eyes. A tree unfurled grasping hands. A rabbit grew a human grin, full of tiny, perfect teeth. The children laughed and chatted as if nothing were wrong, their innocent play transforming into a nightmare tableau before the soldiers' eyes. Marine Sergeant Robert McKinnon described the encounter that haunted him for the rest of his life. There was this girl, maybe 8 years old. Every day she stood outside our fire base with a doll. The doll looked exactly like my daughter back home, same dress, same missing front tooth. She made it talk, and I swear it spoke in my daughter's voice. At first, it told little jokes only my girl would know. Then, it started describing how daddy would die, what his insides would look like, how mommy would cry at the funeral. The girl never looked at me, never even acknowledged I was there. She just played day after day, telling me my death in my daughter's voice. Subsequent intelligence revealed how Den's network made such precision possible. Her agents had intercepted soldiers' phone calls, stolen wallet photos, even gathered letters from home. Teams of former teachers and psychologists, now devoted revolutionaries, analyzed the material to build exhaustive psychological profiles. From these, they engineered personalized torments, each soldier confronted with a private nightmare tailored to breach his individual defenses. The children's campaign carried a second, more poisonous objective. As American soldiers grew convinced that even smiling Vietnamese children might be weapons, they began to experience what military psychiatrists later termed protective paralysis, a crippling hesitation to act, a dread of harming the innocent that left them unable to distinguish danger from humanity itself. They couldn't bring themselves to harm children, even when those children might be gathering intelligence planting devices or whispering carefully engineered triggers. Den understood this instinct and exploited it mercilessly. Protective paralysis became a weapon. Soldiers who hesitated for even a second in a combat zone could be killed before they fired a shot. Their reluctance transformed into a tactical advantage for the enemy. By early 1964, American intelligence began identifying entire regions as psychological kill zones, districts where dense techniques had been applied so consistently that US units assigned, they were rendered effectively combat ineffective within days. The pattern was always the same. First came insomnia, then the creeping sense of being watched, followed by full-scale paranoia, auditory hallucinations, and finally, what one military psychiatrist described as a total collapse of the boundary between external reality and internal experience. The year 1965 brought a new phase of escalation. With the arrival of large US combat formations, Den faced a different psychological landscape. American soldiers lacked the cultural framework that made South Vietnamese troops vulnerable to folk spirit tactics. So she invented new categories of attack tailored with surgical precision to American minds. Her first major experiment was Operation Mirror Mind, launched in September 1965. Its target was not the soldiers' fear of ghosts, but their faith in technology, the very foundation of American military doctrine. Den's operators began planting mysterious equipment along patrol routes, radios that looked more advanced than anything in the US arsenal, medical devices with indecipherable functions maps that displayed American positions with impossible accuracy. The devices were, in truth, little more than captured scraps of equipment cleverly assembled with mirrors, pressure plates, and battery-powered lights. But their appearance was convincing enough to ignite a wildfire of speculation. Reports flooded intelligence channels warning of possible Soviet or Chinese breakthroughs, enemy scanners that could read thoughts, machines that could predict troop movements. Pentagon analysts spent millions investigating these trophies only to discover elaborate fakes. By then, the seed of doubt had already germinated in the minds of thousands of soldiers. Lieutenant Michael Danforth of the 1st Infantry Division described one such find in a letter, later classified for decades. We found a device deep in a tunnel complex. Lights flickered when we moved and displays looked like they were tracking our heart rates. The tech guys couldn't explain it. Some swore it was reading our thoughts. Others said it was predicting our next move. Weeks later, we learned it was just mirrors and batteries, but the fear never left us. For the first time, I wondered if the enemy was ahead of us. Den's promotion to Deputy Commander of the National Liberation Front in late 1965 gave her the resources to magnify these operations across the countryside. With new authority and funding, she created a lattice of psychological warfare hamlets, villages that outwardly appeared ordinary, but were in fact meticulously constructed stages for mental ambush. One such hamlet, near Tai Ninh, became infamous among US units. American forces entered expecting a routine search and clear operation. Instead, they found a village seemingly deserted, except for a single elderly woman who emerged from a hut and began speaking flawless, unaccented English. She claimed to be from Ohio. She recited the names of Cleveland streets, gave directions to a diner that actually existed, even quoted the latest baseball scores from the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Medical examination confirmed she was ethnically Vietnamese and had never left the country. She could not read or write a single word of English. Yet her knowledge of American culture was impossibly detailed, down to colloquialisms that only a native speaker would know. Intelligence officers later discovered she had memorized hundreds of carefully selected facts provided by Den's network and rehearsed them until they were reflexive. But to the soldiers on the ground, the encounter felt like a breach in the natural order, proof that the enemy could reach into the very heart of America without ever leaving the jungle. The soldiers who met her reported months of torment. Afterward, nightmares where familiar voices spoke fluent Vietnamese, where their hometown streets were filled with unfamiliar Asian faces, where mirrors no longer reflected their own identities but transformed them into strangers. The old woman vanished after that encounter, yet others like her began to surface. Villagers with impossible knowledge. Farmers who could describe American cities they'd never seen. Men humming songs that at the time hadn't even been written. It was during this period that Den's campaign reached new levels of subtlety. Her operators began infiltrating the very infrastructure of American military life, not as spies collecting maps and troop counts, but as shadows designed to dismantle sanity from within. They became cleaners, cooks, barbers, interpreters, and prostitutes. Each one was trained with surgical precision in psychological sabotage. A cleaning woman might rearrange a soldier's personal effects so that they spelled out words in Vietnamese words that, when translated, spoke directly to his deepest fears. A barber could draw a blade too close to the skin, leaving a deliberate nick, then whisper that the same thing had happened to another man the day before he was killed in action. These seeds of fear were small, but they grew fast in the fertile soil of an exhausted soldier's mind. Interpreters would bend meanings, mistranslating in ways that suggested betrayal and hidden plots. Allies seemed like enemies. Orders sounded like traps. Even the war itself began to feel like a carefully staged illusion. And the prostitutes, trained to be the most devastating of all, could reduce men to trembling wrecks in a single encounter. They whispered the names of wives and girlfriends back home, spoke in voices eerily identical to women who could not possibly be there, revealed fragments of intimate history no stranger could know. Some soldiers swore that these women aged in an instant, their youthful faces collapsing into the wrinkled mask of old age, predicting exactly how long their clients had left to live. Whether the effect came from clever makeup lighting or induced hallucination has never been proven. What mattered was the impact. Morale plummeted. Trust evaporated. The war was no longer just a fight of bullets and bombs, it was a war inside the mind. By late 1966, Den unveiled what many would later call her masterpiece, Operation Siren's Call. Unlike previous campaigns, this was not aimed at breaking individual men, but at poisoning the fragile trust between Americans and their South Vietnamese allies, exploiting existing racial tensions and cultural misunderstandings. Den wove a tapestry of suspicion so complete that paranoia became a daily ration supplement. It began with subtle changes. South Vietnamese soldiers working alongside Americans suddenly seemed different. A cheerful translator grew silent and withdrawn. A trusted scout made navigational errors that almost seemed deliberate. A liaison officer once fluent stumbled over simple English words he had spoken for years. Medical teams examined them and found nothing. The men themselves seemed bewildered by their own behavior. The truth, when it emerged, was darker than anyone had imagined. Den's operatives had been abducting these Allied soldiers during routine patrols, subjecting them to a form of psychological conditioning she called personality fragmentation therapy. Through sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and carefully calibrated trauma, she broke apart their identities, not enough to turn them into enemy agents, but just enough to make them unreliable, unpredictable, and terrifying to those who depended on them. The result was a new kind of weapon, men who were not traitors but walking enigmas. Every mistake, every slip of memory, every odd behavior created ripples of doubt. Who could be trusted? Who had been broken? Who might collapse next? Just when American forces thought they understood the nightmare they were facing, Den revealed how deep her methods could go. And what came next would mark the most chilling chapter of all. If this story already has your skin crawling, share it with a friend who loves the darker side of military history. Hit the like button to support our work and subscribe so you don't miss the stories that history books never tell. Because the next chapter changes everything. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 is usually remembered as a military assault coordinated attacks across South Vietnam that shook American confidence in the war. But hidden in classified archives is another story. The revelation that Tet was not only a military campaign, but the climax of Den's psychological war. Months before the first shots were fired, the groundwork had been laid. Beginning in September 1967, strange reports trickled out of American bases. Soldiers weren't just dreaming. They were having the same dreams. Shared visions experienced by men who had never met, stationed in different provinces, all recounting the same impossible details. And worse, the dreams were prophetic. The dreams always followed the same dreadful rhythm. A celebration that curdled into slaughter. Fireworks dissolving into gunfire. Friends smiling as their faces peeled away to reveal something pale and wordless beneath. Private First Class Michael Thornton, stationed in Saigon, captured the terror in his journal entry. Dated December 15, 1967, had the dream again last night. We were all celebrating New Year's Vietnamese-style paper dragons, firecrackers, music. Everyone was laughing. Even the locals seemed warm, almost welcoming. Then the dragon opened its mouth, and there wasn't a man inside, just blackness, pure absence. From that blackness came bullets, but they weren't bullets. They were words. Words in Vietnamese that I somehow understood. They told me things no one could possibly know. Things I've buried for years, what I did to that girl in Da Nang, how I really feel about this war. What I want to do to Lieutenant Morrison. Thornton woke to find 7 other men in his barracks had dreamed the same dream word for word. Each had heard different secrets, but the pattern was identical. Their own darkest memories whispered back to them by an invisible voice. As Tet approached, the visions intensified, sharpening from nightmare to prophecy. Men woke drenched in sweat, With the knowledge of specific ambush sites, exact times, even the faces of comrades who would betray them. Some dreamed the wounds they would later suffer. Fear spread like a fever. Entire units were reduced to half strength before a single shot was fired, soldiers refusing to walk certain routes or speak to certain allies because of what they had seen in sleep. Dr. Sarah Blackwood, an army psychiatrist tasked with studying the phenomenon, proposed that Den's network had discovered a way to manipulate dreams using a sinister cocktail of subsonic sound pheromone triggers and carefully staged visual cues during daylight hours. Yet even Blackwood admitted it couldn't explain the impossible men stationed hundreds of miles apart, dreaming the same images on the same night, down to the smallest personal details. Years later, captured documents revealed the deeper truth. Den had spent 2 full years perfecting what she called collective consciousness infiltration, a hybrid of ancient Vietnamese meditation practices, modern psychological conditioning, and weaponized folklore. Her agents had learned to plant what she chillingly named psychic viruses, ideas that spread mind to mind through casual contact, mutating and intensifying with every retelling until they became self-sustaining nightmares. By late January 1968, these operations reached their final crescendo. In the days before Tet Den's operators activated something they called the Revelation Protocol. Trusted South Vietnamese allies began revealing knowledge they could not possibly possess battle plans, not yet drafted intimate facts about soldiers that were never written down. Future events described with uncanny precision. Some spoke in the voices of dead comrades. Others would slip mid-sentence into flawless regional American accents, drawling like homesick GIs from Iowa or Texas, before snapping back into Vietnamese, claiming no memory of what they had said. On the night of January 29th, just hours before the first coordinated attacks, thousands of American and South Vietnamese troops reported the same final omen: absolute silence. Not the uneasy quiet of a jungle night, but a silence so complete it felt engineered. No insects, no wind, no rustle of leaves, as if the world itself was holding its breath for what was about to come. The silence was so absolute that men claimed they could hear their own blood moving, the faint crackle of neurons firing behind their eyes. In that depthless hush came something worse, whispers in Vietnamese that seemed to bloom inside their skulls, counting down toward a calamity they could not stop. When the Tet Offensive erupted across South Vietnam in the early hours of January 30th, 1968, the psychological groundwork proved devastating. The soldiers who had dreamed the attack for months felt a sickening déjà vu. They knew each flash of gunfire before it came, every scream before it left a throat. But foresight brought no advantage. It only paralyzed them. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, defending the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, told a closed congressional hearing, "My men weren't fighting the Viet Cong that night. They were fighting their own minds." Private Anderson kept shouting that this had already happened, that we'd all died and were just replaying our deaths. Sergeant Williams became convinced that some of our own men were enemy soldiers wearing American faces. He shot 2 of his squad before we stopped him. Corporal Davis simply sat down in the middle of the firefight and laughed, saying none of it was real, that we were all still dreaming. The enemy hardly needed to breach the walls. The defenders unraveled themselves. The most crippling stroke of Tet was what Den called the Great Unmasking. Throughout the offensive, long trusted South Vietnamese allies, men who had eaten, trained, and fought beside Americans for years, suddenly announced in flawless detail every deception they had ever engineered. One translator who had worked at McKeevy headquarters for 3 years stood up amid the chaos and calmly listed every piece of misinformation he had planted, every paranoid doubt he had seeded, each small act of sabotage he had carried out, while keeping meticulous notes on the officers he was quietly driving insane. When he finished his confession, he picked up his weapon and fought beside the Americans, as if nothing had happened, later denying any memory of his revelation. Trust, the foundation of military cooperation, disintegrated. Soldiers no longer knew whether their allies were enemies, their enemies allies, or if those categories still meant anything at all. Some swore that during firefights the roles switched mid-battle, Viet Cong suddenly firing alongside Americans, South Vietnamese soldiers turning their weapons without warning, only to reverse again. Whether these incidents were real or collective hallucinations, born of months of conditioning, remains unresolved. Nguyen Tin herself, by then operating with the authority of a general, though not yet formally promoted, directed Ted's psychological dimension from a command bunker beneath a Buddhist temple in Ben Tre. The structure was a labyrinth built for confusion corridors that curved just enough to trap visitors in endless loops rooms with angles subtly wrong enough to unsettle the subconscious incense laced with mild psychoactive compounds to heighten suggestibility. Officers who met with Den swore she could occupy 2 places at once. They would see her in one chamber, only to find her waiting in the next, before she could have physically arrived. Some claimed to hold entire conversations she later denied. Others received written orders in her hand that she insisted she had never penned. Whether doubles drugs or sheer psychological mastery, Den fashioned herself into something beyond human constraint. On February 2nd, as the first wave of Tet subsided, Den broadcast what became known as the prophecy through hidden speakers near American positions. Her message detailed with chilling specificity the eventual US withdrawal, the fall of Saigon, and key political events years in the future. At the time, it sounded like theater. In retrospect, the accuracy was uncanny enough that some intelligence analysts wondered if Den had implanted post-hypnotic triggers in key military and political figures, nudging decisions long after the guns went silent. By April 1974, Nguyen Tin was formally promoted to Major General, the first woman in Vietnamese history to achieve the rank, but by then, her true victory was already complete. Her techniques had achieved not merely military success, but what captured documents later called psychological contamination, the seeding of foreign thoughts inside an entire generation of American soldiers. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973 and the fall of Saigon in 1975 were, according to those documents, events Den had scripted years earlier. In her final campaigns, she no longer sought battles. She planted what she termed seed memories, triggers designed to shape American political and military choices long after the war ended. Veterans carried those seeds home. At VA hospitals, doctors encountered syndromes that defied every known category of trauma. Patients reported memories that could not have occurred, knowledge they had no way to acquire, fears of things that did not exist. They sketched symbols they had never seen, spoke Vietnamese phrases they swore they didn't know, described distant villages with perfect accuracy, despite never leaving their unit's perimeters. Dr. Richard Knowles, who treated Vietnam veterans for 15 years at the Los Angeles VA, recorded cases where the contagion seemed to spread. Family members, therapists, even casual acquaintances began experiencing fragments of the veterans' impossible memories, an infection of consciousness, as if Din's war was still quietly advancing, long after the shooting had stopped. Support groups for Vietnam veterans began reporting phenomena that were more than merely disturbing. Men who had never met, who had fought in different provinces, and at different times began describing experiences that were not just similar but identical, matching names, dates, and sensory details with eerie precision. Again and again, they spoke of a woman they all called the General. Each man saw her differently, sometimes young, sometimes ancient, but every one of them recognized her as the same presence. She appeared in their dreams long after the war, whispering things about their present lives that no stranger could possibly know. In 1982, during the dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., hundreds of veterans experienced what witnesses would later call a collective seizure of memory. In the middle of the ceremony, conversation died at once. Men froze where they stood, eyes unfocused, all turning to gaze toward a single point in the crowd, toward a woman who vanished whenever anyone looked at her directly. For exactly 3 minutes, the veterans remained motionless, silent tears running down their faces before they blinked and returned to themselves with no recollection of what had occurred. Security footage reviewed years later revealed no figure where they had stared, only a faint shimmer in the air, as though the atmosphere itself had been bent or rewritten. The deeper truth behind Den's psychological operations only surfaced in the 1990s when restricted American and Vietnamese archives were partially opened. What researchers uncovered challenged every accepted boundary of consciousness and psychological warfare. Den had kept meticulous records of her experiments, treating them as a scientific investigation into the plasticity of perception and the architecture of memory. Her notebooks, written in a private cipher, blending Vietnamese, French, and mathematical symbols, outlined a methodical exploration of the mind that anticipated modern neuroscience by decades. She described techniques for inducing what she called persistent cognitive anomalies, mental states that could sustain themselves indefinitely immune to therapy or medication. She mapped procedures for linking multiple minds into a single shared experience, allowing memories to spread across distance and time. Most unsettling of all were her instructions for planting dormant experiences. Memories that would remain inert for years or decades, waiting to activate when triggered by a precise stimulus. One entry dated March 15, 1969. Her 49th birthday was especially chilling. The Americans believe war is the breaking of bodies or the crushing of will. They do not see that consciousness itself is a battlefield. A thought can't fire long after a bullet stops. Every soldier who returns home carries more than memory. He carries a new structure of mind, an infection that spreads doubt, fear, the realization that reality itself can be negotiated. This is victory. Not the liberation of the South, but the liberation of the human mind from the illusion of fixed reality. When Den died on August 26, 1992, thousands attended her funeral, including many of the women who had served in the long-haired army. These aging veterans told stories that had never been recorded, operations so dangerous that even Den had refused to write them down. They spoke of methods that could fracture identity, beyond repair of engineered memories, so vivid they could overwrite genuine ones of experiments that reached backward and forward in time to alter events before they occurred. One former operative, Madame Trantihan, offered a final revelation shortly before her own death in 2010. The general taught us that the mind lives in more dimensions than the body. What you call psychological warfare was only the surface. We learned to fight in places without names against enemies who did not know they were enemies, using weapons that were not weapons until the moment they struck. Some of the Americans we fought are still fighting us now, 30 years after the war ended, in battles that unfold in their sleep, in the spaces between their thoughts. They will never be free, because freedom itself has become their prison. The Pentagon keeps a classified file on Nguyen, sealed beneath layers of security, marked for release no earlier than the year 2075, with provisions that allow the classification to be extended forever. Those who claim to have glimpsed fragments of it insist the contents go far beyond ordinary military intelligence. One insider described it as an ontological hazard knowledge, so destabilizing that simply understanding it could unravel the shared reality on which society depends. Within those forbidden pages are reports of psychological warfare techniques capable of shaking the very foundations of human perception. Leaked references hint at incidents that defy the known laws of causality consciousness and even time itself. A quietly circulated memo from 2003, before disappearing back into deeper secrecy, mentioned something called the DN effect. Veterans exposed to Nguyen's operations were said to disrupt electronic equipment. Cameras failed without cause. Audio recorders captured sounds no one had made. Computers displayed data no one had entered. The memo recommended that certain veterans never be allowed near sensitive equipment, and that their medical files remain strictly on paper because digital records showed a disturbing tendency to infect other files with inexplicable anomalies. Modern military psychiatrists who have studied Den's methods have reached an even more unsettling conclusion. Her techniques did not merely plant false memories. They worked by exposing a deeper truth that all memories, all experiences, are themselves a kind of controlled hallucination. Consciousness, they argue, can be hacked, rewritten, and turned into a weapon. The soldiers she targeted were not merely traumatized. They were initiated, forced to confront realities human minds were never meant to face. Dr. Jennifer Crenshaw, who has spent over a decade researching what she calls Den syndrome, explains it like this. Imagine someone revealing that your entire life, every memory, every thought, is only one configuration of consciousness among infinite possibilities. Then imagine they let you live those other possibilities, step into other lives, other selves, all equally real. That's what these veterans endure. They don't have post-traumatic stress. They suffer from multi-reality stress disorder. They're not haunted by what happened. They're haunted by the discovery that happening itself is an illusion. Decades after the war, researchers still struggle to map the full scope of Den's program. Veterans continue to report memories they cannot verify, information they could never have learned by ordinary means. Support groups bring together men who never met in combat, yet share identical stories down to the smallest sensory detail. Military psychiatrists record cases of soldiers anticipating events before they occur or recounting encounters that official records insist never happened. The Pentagon's sealed file on Nguyen remains locked away. Those who have read even a few pages speak of warnings so dire they verge on the metaphysical. The final recommendation, according to a rare leaked summary, is chilling in its simplicity. Do not attempt to replicate, do not attempt to counter. Forget. But forgetting is impossible for those who lived it. They carry the unshakable knowledge that everything we believe about the mind, its limits, its defenses, its very architecture, may be wrong. Nguyen did more than win a conflict. She demonstrated that reality itself can be turned into a weapon, that consciousness has no borders, no treaty lines, no rules. Perhaps that is her true legacy, not a military victory, but proof that the most dangerous weapon ever devised is neither nuclear nor biological nor chemical. It is psychological. And once that door has been opened, it can never truly be closed. What do you believe happened in those jungles? Were Den's methods merely advanced psychology, or did she uncover something about consciousness that science has yet to name? Share your theories in the comments. If this journey into hidden military history unsettled you, subscribe to Sleepy History Tales and tap the notification bell. Pass this story to anyone who believes they already know the full truth of the Vietnam War. Until next time, this is Sleepy History Tales, gently reminding you that the most terrifying battles are fought not on the battlefield, but inside the mind.